Hero, Part 2.
One morning, I was wandering with my sheep through a rather arid region near the Mount of Horror when I saw a bush burning. Strange, I thought. Well, there have been no lightnings here recently, and definitely no nomads in the area. How could a fire start? I wandered over to the burning bush. The longer I watched it, the more intriguing it became. Although flames were leaping in all directions, the bush was totally intact. The leaves and branches, although in the middle of the roaring fire, were not burnt at all. I found the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I stared into the burning bush. Then something happened that made me want to run as fast as I could to as far away as I could. From inside the burning bush, a deep voice suddenly called out.
Moses! Moses!
I stood frozen, almost paralyzed with fear. I managed to mumble, I am here.
Do not come closer. This is a holy place. Remove your sandals.
With shaking hands, I duly complied.
I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob.
At this point, terror took over, and instantly I turned away. I had been taught by my mother that anyone who sees God will die. He continued in the most inspiring voice I have ever heard.
Do not be afraid, Moses. I have heard the cries of my people in Egypt, and I have chosen you to rally them together and to lead them out.
Me? Me? I cried, not believing what I was hearing. I am nothing but a shepherd in a foreign country. The last time I tried to help my people, they turned their backs on me. And besides, I cannot speak properly. I stutter all the time. And besides, they will not believe that you, Yahweh, had sent me. They will.
Moses! Stop talking and listen to me. Tell them I am sent you, and that if they still doubt, then show them this. Pick up your staff and throw it on the ground. Don't just stand like a statue. Do it.
I duly did as I was commanded, and got the fright of my life, when as my staff hit the ground, it suddenly changed into the longest snake I have ever seen, and began moving slowly away from the bush.
Now, Moses, pick up the snake by its tail.
With trepidation, I slowly bent down, and as soon as I touched it, the snake suddenly turned back into my staff. Despite this miracle, I was still thinking up an excuse, any excuse, so that I would not ever become the Israelis' leader. But oh Lord, I don't.
You will rally and lead my people out of Egypt. Don't worry. All the Egyptians who were with you are now dead. You can go and get your brother who can talk the hind leg off a donkey to speak for you.
You mean Aaron? But I haven't seen Aaron for over 50 years.
Well, you will see him shortly. He is on his way to meet you. Now listen and don't interrupt. You, Moses, will lead my people into a land flowing with milk and honey, a land that will be theirs, where they can live and worship freely. Go first to the leaders of the Jews and tell them to get the people ready. Then go to Pharaoh Ramesses and tell him to let the people go. He might resist, but will relent in the end.
I opened my eyes and stared at the bush. The fire was gone, yet it was covered with blossoms. I looked around and I felt like a right idiot, standing barefoot in the middle of the veld, talking to a bush. But I knew then that everything was real, and my rather cozy life was about to change dramatically. The following morning, I went to see Jethro to tell him that after all these years, I was leaving the next day to see my family in Egypt. He never objected. He only nodded his head and said that I must go with his blessing. Well, I had worked for him for 40 years. Early the next morning, we, that is myself, my wife, and 2 sons, set off on a journey that ultimately ended up changing the world. Halfway, I met my brother, whom I never even recognized, but he knew me immediately. I thought he would burst out laughing when I told him what God had instructed us to do. Instead, he only nodded his head and said that as soon as we get back, the first thing we must do is assemble the 12 Israeli leaders, tell them that God's people would soon be leaving the tyranny of servitude and entering a land of freedom, and they must soon get ready. When we reached Goshen, next to the Nile in southern Egypt, I saw that things were bad. In fact, if not worse than when I'd left them. I recognized no one, and no one recognized me. The first thing I did was get hold of the 12 leaders of the tribes of Israel. At first, they were rather skeptical, but when I said, "I am sent me," they became more interested. They ultimately agreed that if I managed to get Pharaoh to agree to let their nation go, they would be ready. One hurdle crossed. I said to Aaron, "Now we must get past the big one." Pharaoh was sitting on his throne as we entered. He had agreed to meet us, more out of curiosity than anything else. Even though I was introduced as Moses, Pharaoh Ramesses had no idea that I'd once lived in his palace. Well, it had been 40 years. We bowed low. "Oh, mighty Pharaoh, I and Aaron are here on behalf of the Israelites. Our people have been in your country for nearly 400 years. We have helped build your mighty pyramids, obeyed your commands, and lived by your rules. All we ask is that you allow all our people, men, women, and children, to go for 3 days into the wilderness to worship and sacrifice to our God Yahweh, which we have been unable to do for nearly 4 generations." I began feeling decidedly uncomfortable as Pharaoh sat back, stared at me. He shook his head and grunted.
You invaded and live in the best regions of Egypt, eat the finest food, and now you want to take a holiday? I
"But
think
sire, you invited us."
because we never thought you would become millions of freeloaders.
"True, your majesty. But then again, you have loaded us with more than our backs can actually handle. We have been your slaves for as
How
many..."
would you like to be a dead slave?
All I could see was seething anger, but I did not care. For the first time, I felt God's Spirit filling my very soul. I picked up my staff. Let me show you that Yahweh, our God, is all powerful. As soon as I placed it on the ground, it turned into a slithering snake. My expectations of fear and wonder were shattered when Pharaoh burst into laughter.
Ha ha! You think you can come here with little tricks and have me trembling? Guards, fetch my sorcerers.
A few minutes later, two men dressed in long robes and wearing weird makeup strode in. Pharaoh pointed to my snake. The leading magician nodded before waving his staff dramatically. As it hit the ground, there was a puff of smoke, and it changed, like mine, into a small snake. I glanced at Aaron. I knew it was nothing more than a conjuring trick. My snake suddenly grabbed the small serpent by its tail and within less than 30 seconds had swallowed it whole. Then began the most hectic months ever to have hit Egypt. 3 months that showed the might of Yahweh, and 3 months, because of being stubborn, resulting in unheard of tragedy. From then on, God spoke to me regularly. For nearly 80 years, I only knew Yahweh from stories told to me by my mother. I had tried to talk to him a few times, but it felt like throwing empty words into the wind. Yet he had chosen me, a liar, a murderer, to not only lead his people, but to converse daily with the Almighty God himself. The next day, I told Pharaoh that if he never let the Israelis go to worship, God would turn his water, every last drop, into blood. I will never forget how he laughed at me as we stood on the banks of the mighty Nile. Within less than 3 minutes after Aaron had lifted up his staff over the meandering river, the once brown water had suddenly begun turning blood red. This included every stream and channel. As a result, the many fish of the Nile were dying and floating to the top. Within days, Egypt became a stinking cesspool with people perishing of thirst. The only water they could get was from speedily dug wells near the Nile banks. The broad smile had completely deserted Pharaoh's face when myself and Aaron walked into his bedroom.
What do you, your servants of Apophis, the god of all evil, want? The Jews will never leave Egypt. Do you hear me? Never, despite your so called blood curse. Instead, they will work even harder by digging hundreds of wells for my people so that they will have clean water to drink.
"Oh, sire," I said as I bowed extravagantly, "Yahweh has only started. Before the sun rises tomorrow, you and your people will wake up to find frogs, thousands and thousands of frogs in your beds, your bathtubs, your breakfasts. You will experience an epidemic like you have never seen before." As true as my word, early the next morning, shrieks and squeals from women and children, plus a number of good, not very brave men, echoed through all the streets of Egypt. All the streets, that is, except those in the Goshen province, where the Jews lived and not a croak was heard.
Okay,
It took the Egyptians 3 days to clean up the piles and piles of dead frogs that caused a bigger stench than the thousands of floating fish in the Nile. But still, a hard-hearted Ramesses refused to let the Jews go. From then on, myself and Aaron found it more difficult to meet with Pharaoh. Despite the fact that through us, God used plagues, earth-shattering plagues, to bring to his knees. A stubborn Pharaoh, Ramesses, only wanted his way. He promised to let the Israelis go, but as soon as the plagues were nullified, he would turn his back on his word, and even made the Jews work harder. After the frogs, and Pharaoh, ignoring his promise, gnats, millions of tiny gnats, covered Egypt like sand from the desert. When Pharaoh still refused to let his people go, God himself replaced the gnats with flies everywhere. Everywhere, that is, except and among the Jews. Pharaoh sent for me and said that if I got rid of the flies, the Israelites could leave Egypt and worship Yahweh. I prayed that night, and by sunrise there was not a fly in Egypt. But then my blood boiled in anger when Pharaoh sat smugly on his gold throne and announced,
Well, after due consideration and meditation, our God, Ra, has informed me that my promise was made under duress, and the Jews must stay to work off what they have taken from this land.
"Oh, mighty ruler!" I spat through clenched teeth. "You think you can dictate to Yahweh? It is like smacking your head against a rock. You refuse to humble yourself before God, and tomorrow you will see his power. May I suggest, Your Majesty, that you have a steak tonight, because tomorrow you will not have any more, and it could be your last." Aaron and I strode out.
To be continued.